So, for tonight, we are talking about discipleship. And this isn't like a lot of other messages where, I prayed about it and asked God what He wanted me to share about. It was more along the lines that it was brought up last week by Greg. Specifically, Greg brought this up. And then I went and asked God about it to see if He would be willing to have us discuss this. And yes, for Greg, but not actually for Greg specifically. The thing of it is that we will end up going over discipleship for a series at some point in time, but I don't know when that is. I just know that, for tonight, we're kind of doing a general kind of overview kind of discussion of it. It's really just to share kind of insights and directions, because the truth is that there's a lot of stuff in the world about discipleship, specifically in Christianity. And it's actually not as simplistic as people like to make it out to be. There seems to be this general, one size fits all, this is how you disciple people. And that's not actually true. In fact, we've just spent, so long talking about spiritual gifts and spiritual offices and rest and spiritual warfare and all these different things. And they all factor in when we talk about discipleship, especially the offices and the gifts. Because one of the big things that we need to understand about discipleship as we sit here and, kind of discuss this topic is that the biggest and most important part of it, it's not just about leading people to God. It's about leading people to know God. It's about leading people to know themselves. It's about helping them to believe, not just in who God is, but in who they are. It's more than just, bringing somebody to church until they say the sinner's prayer and then dropping them off. Because that's what a lot of discipleship really does look like. It's more than just being through some hard times with them. It's a lot more than that. There are a lot of Christians, a lot of believers who, in their interpretation of discipleship, what they do is they take people under their wings, so to speak, and then what they end up doing with that is they just load people up with laws and fear-mongering and all these different reasons for why they should be afraid. And oftentimes they don't even really inspire the individual to grow in any way, shape, or form. One of the biggest problems with leadership in general, let alone discipling, is that they don't empower the individual. Instead, what they do, and none of this is intended, mind you, I don't know a single pastor who I've seen disciple people. Well, that's not true. I don't know all but one or two pastors that I've met are in the boat where they don't intend to do this kind of thing. They don't want people to be completely subservient to them. They don't want people to always be looking to them for all the answers. They don't want people to follow them. They want people to follow Christ. But the problem with that is that a lot of us, it's not well understood how to inspire other people to go out and become something more. And oftentimes there is a tendency for people to kind of relegate themselves to being beneath somebody else. It can oftentimes be a lot easier to just follow somebody else and do whatever they tell you to do, think whatever they tell you to think, to basically just, what's the term? To coalesce with this person as opposed to being your own person. And it's easy to do that with a person over God, especially because it's somebody that's tangible right there with you. And as people who are going to be discipling other people, we need to be aware of this kind of thing and be aware of how to encourage other people to and inspire other people to develop their own walk with God and to appreciate their own walk with God. I think that's one of the hardest things about being about discipling, is that a lot of us a lot of people who end up in the role of discipling other people are more concerned or more preoccupied with whether or not this person is trying, and whether or not, whether or not the person doing the discipling is wasting their time, than they are preoccupied with whether or not this person is actually going to go anywhere. And I think that that's something that we definitely need to have a pretty consistent check on, as well as boundaries for in case they really are just not caring. Because the truth is that we have to kind of find a balance where we're taking care of this person and giving everything that we can to these other individuals, but also taking care of ourselves and taking rest and making sure that our own boundaries are being established so that we can feel safe and comfortable in being there for these people. And that's not something that can just be told. That's something that has to be kind of observed in and of ourselves. Oftentimes it's something that has to be experienced. Because the truth is that, Jeremy has different boundaries than I have. Dusty has different boundaries than Jeremy, and I have different boundaries from Dusty, just to give examples. We all have our own kind of comfort zones. I mean, even when you talk about like the difference between an introverted person or an extroverted person, you find that those are very different boundaries and very different methodologies for how they go about life and function. And that's something that we need to be aware of. See, I think to be very, very clear, I think the first step in discipling other people is to be aware of who you are and what you're about. To be aware of your office, your gifts, your personality, your likes and dislikes, what makes you comfortable and what makes you uncomfortable. Establishing personal boundaries where it pertains to other people, not harsh ones, but rather ones where, revolving around what lets you rest, but also how far you're willing to go for the other people, for the people that you would take on to try to help, to try to protect, to try to develop. And even if, that's really your job. Because the truth is, sometimes, and this is something that I feel does not get brought up in church a lot, because what a lot of people are doing is they're saying, hey, follow this example. Sometimes we're not mature enough to be discipling other people. And I think that that's something that we do have to take stock of and be aware of. If I don't have patience for people in general, then it's probably not good for me, to take on the guy that has really bad ADD, or, the guy that has, to be more specific, to take on that one guy in the church who's overwhelmingly prideful, overwhelmingly angry at everyone else who he thinks has done him wrong, even though, he's been consistently creating his own drama for decades. It's probably not a good idea if I lack patience and gentleness and things like that. If my heart's kind of a mess and I don't really quite know who I am, probably not a good idea for me to try to take that person on and lead them to a deeper relationship with Jesus. Because the truth is my own relationship with Jesus at that point in time is clearly not in a very good place. And I think that's one thing that we have to be really cautious of, and something that we have to be humble enough to be able to admit, is that I'm just not ready. And I think as a community, it's also important for us to not only to not only like be aware of these things, but also to be respectful of people who say that. Like, it's one thing if you have an individual who is clearly ready, but their own insecurities are driving them to disbelief, at which point it becomes the kind of the community's role to come around this person and help them see. But even in that, they're still going to need that time to develop and start to understand who they really are in order to be able to step up and really be that person. But I think there is a culture of respect and honor that we need to cultivate in community. And as individuals, there's a culture of humility that we need to take on in order to really be effective as in discipling other people. You know, talking about the spiritual gifts and everything that came with that, you know, one of the messages, I don't remember exactly which one it was, but no, there were several, that's right. It was in conclusion. But it was talking about the point that, in the application, it was talking about the point that the reason why God gives us spiritual gifts is so that we can be different from the world around us. God gives these gifts in order to help make you a light to the world, to help draw people to you, to help show that, you know, God is different from from the status quo, and that we as followers of him, as people who are sharing in his Holy Spirit, we're different. And if we're not different from the world, then we're just bringing people into another piece of the world. Like when we think about, you know, we all have examples of like really bad churches, okay? But to give like the most extreme bad church that I can think of, we'll talk about Westboro Baptist for a moment. Because, you know, they existed, they were a big deal for a while, and sometimes they still pop up here and there. And one of the issues with them is that they preach a gospel of hate and cruelty. It's very corrupt. And people come and are drawn to that because there are a lot of people in the world who have a lot of hatred. But these people, but where they're effective is where there's the need. But see, the thing about it is, for us as followers of Jesus, these people are not representing Christ in any way, shape, or form, okay? In any way. They've taken scriptures and twisted them, and they don't have any form of the Holy Spirit. They just have the Bible that they've twisted in weird ways. And then they have their own perspectives and their own doctrines that they force on the people around them and a lot of fear-mongering. It's all manipulation. It's all stuff that we talked about in the spiritual warfare series, about how it's effectively taking what should be a good thing and twisting it into something hideous. And the reason why I bring it up is because they're a part of this world and they're playing by its rules. And as followers of Christ, we should not be doing that. God has his whole own set of rules in terms of how to be and to live and the kind of person you can be in this world. You know, we talk about, you know, the freedom from the fear of death that we have. As followers of Christ, we should understand that death is of no consequence to us. But a lot of us don't. Well, I mean, most of the world is afraid of death. Half of the most terrible things that people do, a good number of them are actual survival responses. Because deep down somewhere inside, we have to get ahead, we have to go do these things, we have to have this zeal to make a life for ourselves in this specific manner or meet these criteria, because we're afraid that when we die, we won't leave anything behind, we won't be remembered, we won't be anything, we'll just be, you know, vapor caught up in the wind. Whereas when we have Jesus, we know that we live eternally. And that's something to help to not only, that should be like a kind of a building block, so to speak, a foundation. That's the word I'm looking for. In a lot of ways, this is a foundation for us as people, not just as followers of Christ, but it's a foundation for us as people in this life. Because when you're discipling other people, but you're afraid of all these things, there's going to be a limitation. Jesus talks about how, no teacher can become, or no student can become greater than their teacher. They can only become like them. And for many people, you as the person doing the discipling, you'll end up being the one who is that teacher. And the trouble that a lot of us run into when we talk with immature Christians or people that are looking to us for help, is that if we're not pointing them to Jesus himself, and even if we are, sometimes they won't look to him, they'll still focus on us. And that can be a really difficult thing, but at the same time, we can set a very high bar depending on where we're at as individuals. And especially on where we can be as individuals. And I guess to narrow all this down and remove a lot of the kind of tangent here, we need to become better and move deeper into our own relationships with Christ in order to better affect the people around us, in order to provide something more for them. In a lot of ways, we can grow as individuals for ourselves, but we can also grow for the people around us. Because sometimes they need us. A lot of times they need us. And if we're really just caught up in the things of this world and afraid of death, or afraid of, not getting what we want, or afraid of all these different things, they're going to run into that stuff too. Sometimes they'll take on those same kinds of things. They'll copy us. Other times they'll see that as a reason for why you're a crappy teacher, why you're a crappy example of somebody to disciple them. And they'll use that to dismiss you. And that's not to say that it's your fault or anything like that. It is to say that this is a real thing that happens. At which point, a lot of those people can bail and go walk away from God completely. Or they'll just go find another church or find another whatever. Which leads to an important subject when it comes down to discipling other people, and recognizing that, it's not your job to save them. This is another common mistake in the modern church, in church at large, is the idea that your job is to save souls. Your role as a follower of Christ is to emulate Christ, to exemplify who he is, and also be yourself as he's made you to be. We spend all this time talking about offices because there are specific roles in each individual person where they are a representation of God. And to be that, and to be unabashedly that, and to be active in the gifts that God's given you. But it's not your responsibility to make somebody choose Jesus. It's your responsibility to just be who you are and help them see that. And through that, hopefully you can help them see themselves and the value that they have. But in terms of being the person to ride in on the white horse, save them from the evil dragon that is Satan, that's not really your role. That's Christ's. And a lot of the stuff that I've just been talking about in terms of people looking to you instead of God, a lot of that can be mitigated when you start to let Jesus be the one to ride in on that white horse. Because he will. And even if the timing isn't what we'd like, he will do it. Because if he sent you to somebody or brought somebody to you, he's already calling on them. And he's already trying to reach them. And the thing about God is that he won't give up on people. Even when they tell him they don't want him, he still won't give up on them until the day they die. That's a lot of time, in actuality. A lot of us don't really, when we look back on time, it feels like it's been short. But you'd be shocked how much you can do, even just given the time of a week, how much can happen in just a day. A 24-hour period can involve so much at one time. That's why we can walk away from them feeling so completely scattered and exhausted, because there's a lot to process. And I don't think we really take stock of that. We always think about how short a time we have, which is true, but we also don't appreciate how much can happen in that short time. And especially with God, who, being aware of our lines of existence as much as he's aware of the individuals that we're trying to disciple. When I mentioned earlier about we need to cultivate this kind of culture of humility, it's not just to be humble enough to admit when maybe we're not mature enough to take somebody on, but also when we can be humble enough to accept that God's got this. We're not the hero in this story. We don't need to be. All right. So, starting off with those couple points of like this culture of humility and how that needs to be a big part of, you know, us as individuals, and respect and honor in the community. You know, respecting the person in the church and honoring who they are. That's an enormous thing, because if Stephanie is discipling somebody, it's important for all of us to come around her as opposed to coming against her. And there's grounds for like a confrontation if you legitimately see something that's off, but you also need to pray into that and also need to be careful that you're not like, you know, she's working within the gifts and office that she has, and then you have something completely different, and suddenly you're looking at it sheerly from your perspective and you want to confront her because she's doing something wrong by your standard, and in reality she's doing exactly what she's supposed to be doing. It's why we talked about the offices. You know, I said it a lot during the series, but it's to understand and appreciate that we all have different roles to fulfill. And if you feel like something needs to happen, then maybe you should be the one to step in and to help disciple in that particular category. Because the thing about community when it comes down to discipleship, and this is kind of like an obscure thing, I've actually, as I'm talking about it, I'm realizing that I haven't actually heard a lot of messages talking about discipleship in the community context and how important it is for the community to come around and help raise these people up just as much as the individual. And like the thing of it is that God will call somebody to somebody else. Like sometimes he'll call a person to a church, of course, but I don't think we really always appreciate that as much as we should for what it is, where there needs to be that kind of community kind of coming around these individuals to help build them. But a lot of times what we run into is that, like, you know, this person will walk into Dusty's life and she'll know that she's supposed to like help them with something. But, you know, when I talk about the humility thing, there's a part of this where we need to understand that, okay, am I mature enough to take this on? And understand me when I talk about the maturity thing, a lot of times when it comes down to that, that's about who you reach out to. If God brings you somebody, it's because he trusts you. There's something he has there where he sees you and says, you are able to handle this person. I will make you able to handle this person. But a lot of times we don't always do that. Sometimes we'll look at somebody and say, I can take care of that person. I've got that one. That can be a problem. And the truth is that some of us have, especially we more shepherdly folk who have that heart, there is a tendency to want to reach out to people when we see need. Because part of being a shepherd is seeing not only the need, but also knowing where you can help them. And when you know you can help somebody with their particular need, there's no reason why you shouldn't. Unless, God would be telling you otherwise. But the thing of it is that in this, there's also the humility part of recognizing that you can ask for help when it comes down to these people. And this is kind of the bridge between the individual and community. Because if you have a church body that you're a part of, a community that you're a part of, then you can bring this person and hopefully, ideally we can respect and honor you enough to come around and help you wherever you need help with this person. It doesn't always have to be just you carrying the burden of this individual, because sometimes that's way too difficult. And it's not fair sometimes. Because the truth is that, as we were talking about here, when it comes down to that person that we're taking care of, or discipling specifically, they don't always go for it. And sometimes they want to create more problems. And sometimes they will twist your words in order to do something else. Or sometimes, the truth is that sometimes they say no to you. And when you keep going, because the truth is that when it comes down to the people that are called to us, or that God puts in our lives, it's implicit that we follow through with them to where God is the one who's finally willing to say, okay, stop. And I understand that the truth of that, as far as it being very hard, I've been through enough people in my life where God's brought them to me and I've wanted to reject them because they were just too hard. But the funny thing about it is that I've never done it. I've never told anybody that, I've never cut anybody out of my life. When they became too difficult or when they became unruly or unwilling, I'd always ask God, okay, provide the way here. And I've always trusted God with that. And the funny thing is once it starts getting to that kind of red zone, those people end up gone for one reason or another. They get mad at me over something and step out, or they just decide that they're feeling called elsewhere or something else. And that's okay. The truth is if God is the one who brought them to you, then you should also allow him to be the one to take them away. And yes, there is an important thing in terms of boundaries, but that's something established within the context of a relationship. And oftentimes we need to learn those boundaries in order to have a healthy relationship with that person. And a lot of times our boundaries shouldn't be, if you don't do this thing for me, then I will reject you. But it should be, if you can't be kind or whatever, I'm gonna have to stop seeing you as much, or I'm going to have to diminish this or I can't talk to you. Because the truth is that you're not willing to listen. We can't continue things the way they are right now. And the reason why I say it that way is because there's way too much rejection in the church. There are way too many people who look at Jesus' words Let's go ahead and read the thing that I'm talking about. I believe it's Matthew 10, but I could be wrong. That's where he talks about how the, if your brother comes against you, then, talk to them. Or if they sin against you, then talk to them. If they then sin against you again, get a witness.
Are you thinking Paul?
I was thinking Jesus when he specifically talks about it, and it's not Matthew 10. I'm wrong.
Right, there's a place Jesus talks about it, but I don't think I just kind of read through it all. I think that's one that I've never really remembered where it was. Like, it probably is in Matthew somewhere.
Yeah.
One of those verses where it's like, he said that.
Yeah. Blessed. Well,
How's the rafting?
Oh,
The shoots. I was gonna go last year. Remember we were playing it, but then that fire happened? Sucked from that.
Okay, I'm looking it up. My phone has 5%. We'll see if it. Okay. Oh. Is it Luke 17?
that sounds right.
If your brother or sister sins against, starting on 3.
Mm-hmm.
If your brother or sister sins against you, rebuke them, and if they repent, forgive them. Even if they, it might just be the 70. If they sin against you 7 times in a day, and 7 times come back to you saying, I repent, you must forgive them. Okay.
Matthew 18 is the one that I'm thinking of, starting in verse 15.
Oh, okay.
If your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault, just between the two of you. If he listens to you, you have won your brother over. But if he will not listen, take 1 or 2 others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector. So, the reason why I bring up that verse is that that's actually used a lot as a justification to reject people from the church. Because a lot of people say, when Jesus says, treat them like a pagan or a tax collector, then what he's telling you to do is to reject them from your church. Because the pagans and tax collectors were rejected from Jewish society. In reality, we know that Christ's ministry was not one of rejection, but one of inclusion. And so what that's saying is not reject them from the church, but rather treat them like one of these non-believers who don't know any better. So as a result of this kind of misunderstanding, we've created a lot of damage, and we caused a lot of people to walk away from God because they don't want to be around the church. It's one of those nights. They don't want to be around the church. They don't want to be around God. They don't want to know God because the people of God have hurt them so much. And the truth is that one of the great flaws in human beings is that we judge God by his people more often than not. Even some of us who have been in church for a very, very long time, I've done this myself. That's why I say it this way. Where it's like I've known God and then had a lot of bad things happen in church and finally turned around and been like, you know what? These are your people. I don't really want to be around you. Pulled away from him, even if it was subconsciously I've done it. So it's this kind of consistent thing that we run into. And something to be aware of when we're discipling people is the effect that this can have. It's a big responsibility, and I'd be remiss to express it as being anything else. There's a place to recognize that it's not all ours, but there is responsibility here, and there is accountability here that we carry. Oftentimes I feel like going out and discipling people is treated as too much of an expectation, and it's very blasé. We read the Bible, and a lot of churches tell you go out and make disciples, and people think that that means one thing, and they don't appreciate the detriment that can be caused. They don't appreciate the responsibility that they have, the way that you are a banner carrier for Jesus, and you're bringing that banner to them and saying, this is who I represent. You'll be judged by people, and Jesus will be judged by you through their eyes. So that's part of like why I was talking about that point of like we can become better, and sometimes we need to become better and deeper with God in order to be better and more for the people around us. It's another one of those community elements. Anyways, another side of that thing about talking about seeing it through with people, though. I say this and to kind of establish a point here. Sometimes, God will call you to somebody and you can easily sense that they're not going to get there. But it's still important for you to walk through what God's led you into this season. If it is God that called you to help this person, brought this person to you or whatever, like I said, it's implicit that you see it through because there's something there. One of the examples that I was given to talk about is a particularly hard one. And it's one that we see an example of in John 13, where Jesus is talking to the disciples. And it's starting in verse 21, he says, after he had said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, I tell you the truth, one of you is going to betray me. His disciples stared at one another, at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter mentioned to this disciple that and said, ask him which one he means. Leaning back against Jesus, he asked, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, it is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I've dipped it in the dish. Then, dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, son of Simon. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. And Jesus said to him, what you're about to do, do it quickly. And the reason why I point this particular verse out is because, in the time that Jesus was walking with Judas, Jesus discipled Judas just as he did any of the other 11 disciples. He got just as much of Christ's attention and teaching and whatever he could pour out, he gave himself. But he did that knowing what Judas would do and what Judas was about, knowing that Judas would in fact be his betrayer. And, that might seem like an obscure thing, but I've had God do this to me before, where he put me in front of somebody and told me that they were going to betray me, but nevertheless wanted me to give my whole heart in being involved with that person, in the sense of in community and relationship as friends. And I told the guy right up front in one of our first meetings, this is what God told me about you. He said that you were going to betray me at some point later on. He and another friend. I told them that point blank. They denied it, of course, because everyone always does. And then years later, it happened. The point is that there was a lesson there that God was trying to illustrate, something that he was trying to help me understand about himself in terms of what it's like for him to be working with us and with the church at large. The way that he can see so clearly how a lot of us are going to be. But he still continues to press on, knowing that we'll betray him and we'll push him away and we'll not care about what he's saying or, focus on distractions or other such things. The thing of it is that we have to understand and give grounds to follow God in this. Again, that culture of humility. I think that that's ultimately one of the most important things when it comes down to discipling people, is to be humble. To be humble before God, to be humble before yourself, to be humble before them even. Because this is something that changes people. A lot of cultures, a lot of people in general, even on an individual basis, they venerate pride in some form or another. And if we come to them venerating our own egos, our own pride, they're going to do the same. They're going to learn from that. You see this happen a lot in churches with youth pastors and their youth group members. How a lot of times the youth pastors will have these kids that gather around them and try to exemplify them as much as possible. Whether they intend to or not, it's what they do. And it's something that for us, as people who God will send out to disciple other people, it's something to be aware of. And it's something to be willing to surrender before God over and over and over again. And even to be okay with messing up with. Because like I said at the beginning, there's a lot of discipleship that can only really be learned by experience. And, in terms of discovering your own boundaries, your own limitations, where it is that you need to say no. For example, if you're somebody who's called to disciple somebody else,
67:55:36.
there's kind of a check sometimes in that, if you're already exhausted and run to the ground because you're already discipling like 6 other people, and suddenly number 7 shows up, and you feel like you're supposed to, but you're not totally sure it's God, it might be a good idea to say no. Or to see if you can't direct them to somebody else. Or to even spend some time in prayer and see if God wants you to take that person on as opposed to another person. The point is that we have to learn these boundaries. And the truth is that a lot of us in that situation wouldn't say no. We'd take on the extra person and then be more overwhelmed.
Can you get Edgefield spirits?
I know I've done that myself many, many times. And it's something that God's been trying to work me out of, that kind of mindset. Because the truth is that when we start discipling people, a lot of the time what we run into is this feeling that we start to recognize how few other people are out there to actually take on these people to help. And that can be really hard to recognize the need of an individual in front of us and accept that maybe we can't meet that, maybe we shouldn't meet that, because we want to help. And sometimes we have to fight with ourselves to say no. I can't do this right now. I can't be everything that I need to be in order to fulfill the role that this person needs fulfilled.
Then sometimes, like, when you do, like, realize that, if you were to realize that and keep going with it, you risk, like, running everything into the ground with them, and, like, everything just implodes.
Yeah.
So it's not like a selfish thing, I think, to, like, actually give into that whole I can't help you, I know I can't.
Yeah.
Where I think a lot of people do see it as that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Exactly. And that's actually another big thing. Like I was talking about at the beginning about kind of a lot of the misunderstandings about discipleship, and about how there are a lot of them. I didn't specify a whole lot. But I think that one of the problems that we really run into, and I appreciate that you mentioned the selfish thing, how a lot of people view it as selfish to say no. Because a lot of us are really functioning on guilt and shame still. And the truth is that a lot of us in the church, like, we've been raised with so much of that, and it makes it really hard to do anything that could be perceived as selfish, even to the point of taking care of ourselves. When we went through the rest series, for example, or when we talked about the gift of tongues, and about how that was a gift that more often than not is meant to help the individual who has it, more than it is meant to help the people around them. But the thing of it is that we don't recognize a lot of times, because we're raised and taught this very clear doctrine of, okay, you have to go give everything of yourself all the time, otherwise you're a selfish person. And as a result of that, we don't appreciate things like rest or self-care. And obviously, like, one thing that all of us can agree on is if you do too much self-care, you are selfish. And there's a boundary line that we have to establish, where we can't be, like, hurting other people in our attempts to take care of ourselves, or being disobedient to God in trying to take care of ourselves. But we do need to take care of ourselves. And that's okay. And that's not selfish. In fact, it's actually better and more important, because if you have those 7 people that you're taking care of, and you're running yourself into the ground, and suddenly you can't breathe anymore, and everything implodes, they're all affected. Like I've just been talking about, relating to the responsibility thing, and how you are that banner carrier, and the effect you will have on them is a negative effect. And especially, like, as you start to get worn down, because eventually you'll get emotionally worn down, and you start getting snappy and pushy and angry. You start saying things that you don't mean because you're just too tired to maintain your own standard. You know, suddenly you start hurting people. You don't mean to, you don't want to, that's not your heart. But that's the point when things start to unwind and unravel. So rather than letting it happen where it gets to that point, you can say no to that person, recognizing that it's going to be better for yourself, but at the same time it's going to be better for all 7 of those other people that you don't do that extra work. So it's an important thing to be aware of when we start discipling other people. Not just, am I mature enough, but can I actually do this? And why do I think I need to? So, talking about the subject again of discipleship, And like, if this is kind of like a long and scattered message, it's because there's a lot to talk about. Like, this isn't a one and done kind of message. Like I said earlier, when I was talking to God about this, we'd end up doing a series over this at some point, but not right now. Anyway, kind of the last few things that I wanted to try to address was to especially try to bring everything together here in terms of kind of boiling this message down to talk about discipleship and making disciples and so on. You know, and specifically like the community aspect, the offices and giftings, and the ways that those things play into this. So, because they work together very strongly, at least they can if we're willing to. And again, that humility thing, you know, asking that question of, can I do this? Well, the offices provide, like, when we talked about those, they help provide like a good foundation for each of us and what we're able to do and what we're able to provide. And when it comes down to the people that we try to help or disciple, maybe we're not the best to satisfy all of the needs that somebody might have. And that's something that we can accept humbly. We should be able to anyways. Because the truth of it is like, you know, for my office, I'm not going to be the best at everything involved in being there for somebody, in discipling a person. I'm not necessarily the best person to go out and try to like bring people to church. I'm not necessarily the best person to try to really develop intimacy with God in somebody. I can help, and I can do some because I'm gifted to do some, but the truth is that that's not really my area of expertise, if that makes sense. And I don't say that to say that God can't lead me to do more or any of that. I'm just saying based off of what I know of myself, there are real limitations that I have to acknowledge about myself, and those are okay. Because it's always said that it takes a village to raise a child. And at the end of the day, when we're honest about it, that's what we're doing. Discipleship is that. You're taking somebody and helping raise them up. And it's a really important thing, but it's also a really involved thing, and it takes more than just one person. That's why, I mean, being a single parent is hard. Some of us have had those. They had a hard time with us because we made it hard. Well, I did, anyways, with my mom. The thing is, though, is that, like, you know, there's still ground to allow other people and other voices in. You know, like I said earlier, if you're an evangelist and you see something where maybe the prophet who's discipling somebody isn't really doing very well, we don't have to confront the prophet and condemn them for where they're failing. You could offer to help. That's a perfectly reasonable way to approach an issue, which I just feel like people don't think to do that very often. And that's perfectly okay. Nobody is going to condemn you for asking for help. The point is that there's room for us to grow people together. And it doesn't always have to be, you know, your job to go disciple. It can be our job to build and disciple. That's okay. That's perfectly fine. In fact, that's even probably just a tad on the scriptural side. You know, when Paul talks about the offices specifically, it is in the context. I mean, we went over that verse so many times in Ephesians 4, but the context of it is in bringing people up. And that's the other side of it, to be specific about discipling, and one of the most important aspects of it is to see somebody for who they are. and that's a child of God. And even to remove the generality, but to see the specific parts of that person. If I look at somebody, I can pray about it. Well, first off, I can perceive good things about any individual, right? There's no person in life that we only see bad things about, unless we're trying really hard, trying. Or letting our own bitterness and judgments blind us. Again, trying. The thing is that if we're willing to drop that stuff and look at somebody objectively, honestly, we're going to see good things about them, no matter who they are. And there's a place for us as we disciple people to help them flourish in the good and to remove themselves away from the bad, the dross, the sinful stuff, the pride, the ego, the whatever that keeps them away from God and keeps them in places of imprisonment, keeps them shackled to the enemy. So we can help see that stuff, and we can look for it and look at it. And in a lot of ways, that's very, very important on the grounds of discipling anybody, because we need to be able to do that, and they need us to be able to do that, because they're not going to remember. They're not going to know half of it. They're going to get caught up in their own sin and the guilt and shame and stuff like that, because the enemy's going to try to feed it to them. And it becomes implicit for us to be able to see this stuff, because we can help them remember who they actually are, and especially when they start making mistakes in the church, because it always happens. And there's a place for us to not take responsibility for where they make mistakes. It wasn't our poor leadership. Everybody's culpable for their own choices. Where we are responsible is for our choices and our behavior and our actions. That's the only thing that we control. So if this person goes so far as to decide that you're not a good disciple or maker, and they want to reject you, and then they go back to their life of sin, that's not on you, usually. Like, unless you did something specifically bad that you are aware of, but you're going to be aware of it. It's not going to be the kind of thing where you made a mistake, where you tripped. It's going to be the kind of thing where you made a choice. Those are the only times when we're responsible. Again, we are in control of ourselves and responsible for ourselves in this area. Not for them. I've had people, I can think of one person in particular who I took under my wing as part of a group. And he got mad at me and exited the group, citing my ineptitude at leadership, believing that I wasn't doing a very good job of leading the group that we were a part of. And he had a long list of explanations for why I was wrong. But of course, when I asked him about it, I'm like, okay, so do better. He couldn't do that. And the point was that what he was really doing was just trying to create reasons for why he was justified to do this. It wasn't really about me, per se. And it wasn't my responsibility that he wanted to leave and all these other things. I didn't make it happen. And it was hard for me to accept that. But it's important for us in general to learn from these kinds of experiences when people share these kinds of stories, because we all need to remember this stuff. I can think of one person, on the other hand, who I did actually drive away, who I hurt. And in that particular instance, I was responsible. I made the choices, I said the things, I picked that fight. And as a result, this person would have nothing to do with the gospel. That one was on me. God forgives, and I was able to be forgiven of this, and grace intercedes on our behalf. But the point is that we have to be able to delineate between what is and isn't our fault, instead of shouldering the blame for everything. It's not always something that we're good at. So to kind of quantify it a little bit, if you're going to be discipling people, be humble about it. Be humble about even entering into it as an individual. And also look to your community, because they can help you if you'll let them. And as a community who's coming around people who are discipling other people, we need to respect and honor that person and help them. If they ask for help, trust what they're doing, give them space to do what they need to do, what God's sharing for them to do. Because if God brought that person to them, there's a reason for that. God said, I want this person to be with you right now. And if you think you could do better, check yourself. Because maybe your ego is getting in the way of your judgment. Pray about it. Talk to other people about it. Talk to the individual about it. But be respectful and be honoring of who they are and the fact that God chose this person. Understand the responsibility that you carry as when you're discipling people, but also don't let it smother you, because that can be just as destructive to any form of discipleship that you do. Recognize that it's not you, it's God, and that even without you, He will still work to bring this person to Him. And the other thing is, know that this is an honorable charge. If God has chosen for you to do this, He believes in you. If He believes in you, that means there's something about you that God Himself is seeing and says, I can trust my kids with that person. It's not because He's trying to hurt you, it's not because He's trying to overwhelm you, it's not because He's trying to punish you in some way, but there is something. And the truth is with God, He believes in us, and He believes in those people that He's bringing to us. He has a lot of faith in His creation. Even when He knows we're still going to make other choices, He still chooses to put Himself out there and have faith in us. And if we're part of Him, He puts us out there with Him, because we're part of this ride. It's a good thing, and it can be an absolutely beautiful thing, in that there are so many ways that God will teach us about Himself and about ourselves in the process of this. And anything that He can use, He'll use as a teacher. So that's what I've got.